Thank you everyone for coming today to PSU Studio MFA Remote Visiting Artist Lecture. This event is sponsored by the PSU School of Art and Design. The series brings together artists, curators, and critics from a variety of disciplines to explore the subjects of their own work. For today's remote lecture, which is the final part of our spring term series, I have the pleasure of introducing Kahlil Robert Irving. Irving is an artist currently living and working in the USA. He attended the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Art at Washington University in St. Louis, where he received his MFA, and the Kansas City Art Institute, receiving his BFA in Art History and Ceramic Sculpture. His work has been exhibited at the Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art in Kansas, the Arizona State University Art Museum in Phoenix, and the Rhode Island School of Design Museum, among others. Irving was selected to participate in the 2020 Great Rivers Biennial hosted by the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis, where he will present a solo exhibition post the COVID-19 pandemic. Recently, Irving was awarded the Lewis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Grant. In 2018, Irving's first institutional solo exhibition took place at Wesleyan University's Center for the Arts and was accompanied by a full-color catalog with essays and an interview. Currently, he is presenting a large-scale commission on the project wall at the Contemporary Art Center, Cincinnati, Ohio. Irving's work is also featured in Making, Knowing, Craft in Art, 1950 to 2019 at the Whitney Museum of American Art. His work is in the collections of J.P. Morgan Chase Art Collection, New York, Nerman Museum of Contemporary Art, Kansas, the Carnegie Museum of Art, Pittsburgh, and the Whitney Museum of American Art, New York. And yeah, without further ado, I'll let Kahlil start his presentation.
Thank you so much, everybody, for having me. It's a very complex time that we're all in and what we're dealing with, and it's nice to be able to be here with you all to share a bit about what I do, but also be able to participate in the larger conversation of cultural production today. Share my screen. So I'm going to give a little presentation about and a bit of an overview of my practice and give you a little bit of information to what I'm working on right now. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, born in San Diego, California, and I saw this site all the time. It's the St. Louis Arch in the distance, and they billboard to Johnny Brock's, which is a costume shop in St. Louis. That's a kind of corporate sale place where you can get costumes and dress up for Halloween or different special occasions. And this view from the highway is quite interesting to me because when you travel from one area of St. Louis to another, you usually have to get on the highway. St. Louis has quite a few different billboards throughout it, and this view is a very important and influential part of my work, and it becomes more important as I grow up or grow into my practice post graduation from Washington University. In 2011, I came to New York City to be a part of the New York City residency program. It's a consortium. It was a consortium of ACAD schools that had a studio in Dumbo that provided students a space during the semesters to come to New York and experience what it was like to be an artist in the city. I came for 1 month in the summer after my first year of foundations, and I made these drawings. I think about my practice as an evolution from these drawings, because the conflation of these geometric shapes are creating a constructed perspective that's all my own. I think that that detail is embedded in all of the things that I do and all the things that all artists do, that we're all constructing our own perspectives from details or elements around us. Going from there, I went back to school in Kansas City and I made these large tile sculptures where there are objects protruding off the surface, textures that are embedded into the surface of the tile, and patterns and textures situated on the surface. Thinking of the city as a space of construction leading towards a sky or building up from the ground. We're always so situated in relationship to the ground and dreaming of the sky above. That's really instituted because of gravity. And so how do we deal with our dreams in relationship to that, to our physicality and limited physicality and performance in this life? I went to Hungary to study abroad, and switching from making things and forming material by my hand, I embedded found objects into clay and burned the materials away, creating these fossilized objects where the materials in which I burned away don't exist anymore, but the remnants of their space is still present. Using rice, socks, t-shirts, cans, just about anything that I could get. My aim was to try to make something that, at that time, I said I wanted to make something that no one had ever seen before. But now I think about it in terms of a very complex abstraction that at that time I wasn't able to negotiate or rectify presence and absence, which I am learning and kind of navigating more coherently now in my practice. But these foundational remnant objects allowed me to see the presence and absence of something, but also showing that an object and its materiality can transform because of different elements. So this is a fragment of a sculpture, but you see the impression of a can in the object, formed in the object, but then you see the glaze, the dark stain, the metal sheen that you see is actually that can. And so the can is present in texture, but also present in its material. This sat inside of that object. So how do you balance a reality or a physicality between spaces? Ceramic material is able to withstand and capture. I studied abroad in Jerusalem in 2013 to 14, and this is a work entitled Found Land. And it uses sand from the Red Sea and different materials that were available to me and other students studying at the Bezalel Academy of Art and Design. But the way I imagined the material mirrored the landscape around me. Not being an Arab, but having an Arab name, not speaking Arabic, it was complicated. So to see destruction and occupation in such a complex way in Jerusalem and in the West Bank, these works kind of mirror similar realities that exist in the US that exist to other Black and Brown people around the globe. Embedded here on the right of the sculpture, you can see the edge of my Converse shoe. You can see my shoelace still tied, but you see it from the inside. But going back to the complicated abstraction that exists in these works, I came back to the US and realized that there's no scale or understanding of those previous works. And so seeing found objects collect in the sewer line, I thought, well, there would be a way that I could cast found object in clay that then could give the viewer a scale relationship to everything that they're seeing. And so I made collage masks in 2014. Everything you see here is ceramic. It's been fired in the kiln over 30 some odd times with enamel, decals, and luster. Thinking about a very complicated history of ceramic production across the globe, and then how does that relate to an experience of living in the United States? Well, the transatlantic slave trade did not just bring people, it also brought objects, it brought seeds, it brought food, it brought different things that weren't in this land. And so these objects kind of embody the history of decorative objects using iconography from my life and kind of trying to find a balance between a personal narrative and a social and cultural narrative that relates to a larger experience. Along with these sculptures, I made patterns in Photoshop that were limitless. And then that also was used, these images were used to print and transfer onto the ceramic. And so the details that you see within the work, you see the fried chicken, you see the roses, and signifying something that may relate to the object that you see, but also may allow for another trajectory of recognition within the work. So a to-go food box may be filled with fried chicken, but what if the fried chicken is its texture or its image on the outside instead of white styrofoam? What if the container was made of fried chicken instead of having to fill the box with fried chicken to then share it with others? But it's a complicated kind of poetic mashup. Along with collage masks, I made this work, popular masks. And alongside making these sculptures, I've also been making pottery since I was 12. And that's how I got introduced to dealing with ceramics. I didn't think of it as a craft or a making art or really anything until I went to a place called Craft in the Future in St. Louis, which is hosted by an organization called Craft Alliance. And at that organization, I was an escape. And so attending college, thinking about my experience when I was in high school, making a lot of objects, I collected these pots that I made and amassed them in the structure that recalls a history of object making, but also is telling a new story. It's called Unity. And from there, I built on this project entering graduate school, and this work is entitled Concerned Student 1950, or the Johnson Family Reunion. After being harassed by faculty members in graduate school and undergrad, being harassed by some of my colleagues, it was a huge shift to see students at the University of Missouri Columbia protesting the treatment of Black students on campus that then mirror the protests that we see in the streets today. But we know, and if you don't know, that this is a constant reality for a lot of people in the United States, then there's something wrong. And that's what people are trying to say right now. But I mirrored that, the name of this group in Missouri, to a movie that was called recently, or not recently, but it's a film with Cedric the Entertainer, and it's called The Johnson Family Vacation. But the Johnson Family Reunion is also a signifier for all Black families named Johnson. And so how do we deal with our relationship to an amassment of Black people, and why is it so related to violence? Or why are people so scared when you see Black people gathering? That led me to thinking about, and a colleague of mine, Denise Ward Brown, was explaining to me the history of sundown towns. And Anna, Illinois was turned into an acronym, and there are about 10,000 of these towns across the United States. But I'd argue that there are more, because these are only places where people say they're sundown towns. But in fact, when you have a population that's solely white and no Black people live around, it could easily participate as a sundown town. And so I then made this sculpture entitled Before and After Sundown, comma, town, and thinking about the delineation of time in the viewer's experience of interacting with the work and traveling from one side through the middle to the other side. You see that time, but also referencing a desire of time of like when we can be like the time before sundown towns, the time during Jim Crow laws and racial violence, and then after. The sculptures are about 5 feet tall, or the platforms are 5 feet tall, and the cumulative vessels relate between 4 inches to 12 inches. I have amassed about 700 of these objects over the last several years. And this is an installation entitled, I Love Who You Are, I Love Who You Ain't, using the structure as a way to recall the truss bridges that cross the Midwest all the way from Pennsylvania to Kansas, I would say, built to allow transit from place to place, to take material, to take people. And so the reflectivity of the glaze in which I use allows for the viewer to understand that in the title, I Love Who You Are, I Love Who You Ain't, can be a conversation between the objects and the viewer, and me and the objects, or me and the viewer. As I peered into each object, making them, the viewers then have to peer into each object upon their arrival at the gallery. So I have multiple projects running simultaneously all the time as a way to kind of rectify this constant negotiation of my reality and my performance as a human and a participant, as a person who's inherited a life in the United States. For my graduate thesis project, I worked with a woman named Saria Conaway, who's a musician, composer, performance artist in St. Louis, Missouri. And she arranged a special arrangement of the Black National Anthem. And her and 3 other women sang those words to 3 flags that I made in graduate school. One is titled, Many Men, Many, Many, Many Men Wish Death on Me. That's the black on black one that you see in the foreground. Black and white flag is, Lord, I don't cry no more, look to the sky no more. And the last flag is, Have Mercy on Me, which is a white on white striped flag. Using the language and the lyrics of a 50 Cent song as a way to re-engage and reorient perspective from rap music, but also as a way to memorialize performance and action in day-to-day life. The performance rang through the Kemper Art Museum. My friends told me that they felt really confused and never seen racism so blatant. When they were singing, they heard the countless voices around them still talking. This is a complicated, it was a complicated conversation that I had to negotiate with friends who don't normally participate in art world spaces, and trying to explain to them and communicate and hear and feel what they felt, because I felt it so long that I've kind of gone numb to it. And maybe that's part of the fight that I continue to negotiate and rectify within making my work. So alongside of that performance, I had a show in New York City. I was in a group show at the gallery entitled Callicoon Fine Arts, where I currently exhibit and work with them as partners. And these collages were made to address new sculptures that I was making for an exhibition that the gallery invited me to put together, and I titled it Streets, Chains, Cocktails. And I'd never been able to really reflect and deal with my experience after Michael Brown was murdered and visiting my mother's family, and very problematic things were said from them. And so I made these objects that were combining new objects and older artifacts that I had in my studio, um, really working to negotiate and create this conversation between contemporary violence against Black people, but not just Black people, many people. This narrative is about Black people in relationship to the evolution of colonial oppression, and how we signify certain ceramic patterns to delineate or communicate wealth or value, but then also what has been amassed to show that value, and what better material to engage that with but ceramic. A lot of people talk about my work in relationship to craft, and I'm kind of ambivalent to that language because it's been co-opted over and over. And at this time in my practice, I really was starting to think about my work in relationship to industry. Industry meaning the materials are mined from the earth for factory production. So there's a kind of heightened craft that exists within that production that's not necessarily relative to the single soul artist working in their studio, in their single laboratory, where they then emerge and share these things with the world. Things are made by the thousands. And I wanted to try to recall that experience of dealing with objects produced by the thousands in other materials, and then translate them into ceramic. As you can see, to-go boxes, soda bottles, paint cans, and different objects. This is the text that I use to, or this is the way that I format text to deal with titles, sculpturally dealing with text as much as sculpturally dealing with the textures of daily life and contemporary issues. Mixing time is also important to me. This is one of the sculptures from the show. This is another installation view. Black and blue, RIP, new layers, no charges for Wilson or Europe. Historically, we have continuously dealt with people saying, oh, I'm sorry, let's just move on. But that behavior disallows us to rectify the problematics of our performance as humans. You know, Darren Wilson's never been charged and never will go to jail for his violent and criminal activity in the United States, and Europe is never going to give up the power. You know, it's almost like it has to be stripped away from the power, from the oppressor to truly force them to change. And this work I'm calling to the fore a relationship between the violence of Darren Wilson killing Michael Brown in Missouri, but also the appropriative history of ceramic production by the Meissen factory in Dresden, Germany. The objects, the white clay that you see is not objects broken down and melted in the clay or melted in the kiln by me. It's actually material formed by me then using the imagery and pattern of the Meissen decorative blue and white ware on the material that then you make that association. In my work, you'll also see these blobs or foiled, crumpled pieces of foil. That's actually ceramic using different metallic lusters to associate that in the object. This is another view of the work. Rear view of the exhibition. I just want to say quickly, this is the first time exhibiting a larger work on paper, and it will continue to evolve going forward. There's also one behind me on my wall. I'm interested in making new things and trying different materials. So it's not, so my practice isn't solely related to ceramic, but also other materials too. This work is titled City County. And this one is entitled Lost Found Chance. Using paper as a material also to reveal and hide information, but also relating the celestial to the ground, and how materials can be transformed, and you can embed things within the object that can recall other things, and it's not solely just this on paper. Like, this is made using the techniques of this is made by the techniques of printmaking, but it is desiring and it is operating as a sculpture. From there, I had a I was offered to do a solo exhibition at Wesleyan University. Rosemary Lennox, the program director there, asked me to submit a proposal, and I was like, whoa, a proposal. And I thought, well, maybe if they, someone shared with me, if they were going to give you a show, you should just wait for people to give you a show. Don't worry about submitting a proposal. And at that time, I had just graduated from my master's. I had returned from studying, like doing a residency in Hungary. And I said, well, I really don't have any opportunities coming up. I should really submit this proposal. And so I went in a back and forth conversation with the university, and we then arrived at this. It has been a pleasure to work with the staff and curators and students at Wesleyan University, and it's been a invested relationship over the last several years. This exhibition was titled Street Matter, Decay and Forever, Golden Age. There are 13 ceramic sculptures in the distance. You see 14 works on paper on the floor. You see a large structure in the distance and works on panel on the right on the wall. I don't know if this thing actually, if you can see this thing on YouTube, but I want to move it. And so this exhibition was working to kind of bring all the ideas that I had been working on for the last several years together in one space. The works on paper that I've made in the past, the big ones and the small ones, are trying to recall the ground. So I've learned a way by a friend to create these frames in which the prints could sit on the floor and operate in relationship to the perspective in which they are created to mimic. Thanks to Lyndon Barwa Jr. helped me make those frames or learn how to produce those frames. The sculptures are an evolution from the last project, where you see new objects being used, but now the ceramic is recalling a different trajectory, and I'll share some more photos of those in a minute. But I want to get to this big sculpture because a lot of people have been asking me about it. And the vinyl printing is a way to share or disseminate information, and this cloud imagery is a construct of a series of different sky photographs that I collaged together in Photoshop. And this mobile, it's titled Mobile Structure, Road in Relief, Cortege Malcolm Martin, Stop, Drop, and Roll. And this is, you see in the protest today, where a lot of people are gathering around historical monuments to the racist history in the US. And I've been trying to think about in my practice, are there any other ways that we can think about monuments without showing a figure or using the body as a way to then memorialize or be an icon for that moment in time in which we want to talk about. And Maya Lin did that beautifully with the Vietnam Memorial in DC. And is there any way, she took everyone down into the earth, but is there any way to rectify this relationship going up into the sky? It's serene, it's beautiful. But does that have any relationship to the history of European religious oppression, that God is in the sky, that heaven is in the sky? I wonder that all the time. The back of the sculpture has this long flowing flag that was printed on canvas, and it was originally made as a print on a residency in Venice, Italy in 2016. And I digitally scanned it, and then with the help of Ben Chaffee, the curator at the Center for the Arts at Wesleyan, we figured out a way to reprint it and present it in this fashion, and expanding its scale. At one time, its original scale was 11 feet, and now it's 25 feet. But it's also not a traditional US flag. If you count the stripes and you count the stars, and you look at the stars also have a black circle in them. This work was presented in a myriad of different ways, and it's interesting to see it live in this manifestation, complicating the making by the hand, but also presenting it in this fashion as in canvas. This is an image of after Malcolm X was assassinated and he was taken away on the gurney. And the title of the previous sculpture in the middle has Cortege Malcolm Martin, and a cortege is a funerary procession. We'll never be able to process enough for the people who lost their lives to make a difference in this country and around the world, to work to deconstruct and reimagine a life without racism and Eurocentric dominance. And so whenever I make that work or show the work or show the flags, they're all to recall that the history and the memorialization of those historical figures and the figures that are working and dying today. I really love the texture of a Google image search. We think about things, or in philosophy, things have been described as to compartmentalize and to separate, or psychology. And I think a Google image search like this is a very immaterial, but very material way of showing that in an image. And so from different materials, I evolved in the way I make my decals and address the surfaces of my sculptures. And so this is now an object on its own. I have been taught that things operate in a certain very process step-based way, and working with the people at Wesleyan, it allowed me space to constantly think about how things can be transformed. And so this collage is a way that I have taken the materials in which I work with and transform them and allow them presence in another way. And this is internet data collage, in parentheses, focused eye. So some people ask me, where do I get my forms? I 3D print forms to make molds that then get cast into ceramic. I collect hobbyist molds that have been produced between the 50s and the 70s. You might see Christmas trees or Santa Claus or nativity scenes made in ceramic, and they are produced from molds like this. Or if you go to your paint your own pottery shop, you would use a mold similar to this, but in these molds, you can see forms that relate to historical objects. And so here on the left, you see a set of garniture. In the distance, you see this is Danish porcelain, and then in the distance, you see Meissen. And in this, I think of the trajectory or kind of the evolution of how we are or where we are today, using memes and screenshots from different sources. And so using molds, hobbyist molds, allow me to recall a history of ceramic production, but I don't have to be isolated or limited in how then the object is then presented, but also produced. I can use different materials. It doesn't have to be white clay. It could be brown clay. It could be red clay. This is another pattern that I've made, kind of trying to negotiate my thoughts. Map of the North America with the different tribes that live throughout the whole continent. Chain link fence is a motif that I use quite often, that you see all over the place in rural and inner city spaces. Some people would say that it's an urban icon, but I would say that it's a icon of separation and dominance for our minds and our physical relationship to space. It delineates where you can go, where you can't go, but you still can have access to it emotionally and physically because you can see it. And how do you negotiate issues of power, like the Food and Drug Administration, like this meme says, they were put together so they can put drugs in the food. It's like, how do you deal with a co-opted trust that we've put into an environment like the USA? Move this so you can, so this is another collage that I've made. Protests in a shopping mall in St. Louis, and then the monochromatic degrees of blue on the left. It's interesting to see this, to think about the conversations today about good cop, bad cop, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, it's all infrastructurally tied. So you can't say it's just the cops or it's just the president or it's just this or it's just that. It's the consortium that then creates it's kind of like a zipper. How do you unzip the zipper of the construct of oppression and violence that creates the capitalist structure in which we live in? And this is the Long Gallery at the Swinger Porcelain Museum in Dresden. And you see porcelains on the wall, you see objects, you see the space. It's very opulent and decadent. Some of these objects are from the Dresden factory production itself, but it's also a collection of objects in which they've either stolen, purchased, or raped from around the world, specifically China. And then they appropriate the same motifs and constructions that the Chinese were producing for their own gain, because they wanted control of the market of object. And so instead of making their own, they co-opted another culture's production to then manifest their domination. Oh, this work is entitled 100s. And as I was describing a few minutes ago, you can see the vase here and the vase here being made out of something that looks very concrete-like. And then you see the glaze on the surface, and you see the text then transferred on the surface of it. On the object on the right, you see something made similar to concrete with white bits embedded in it. And those white bits have floral motifs on them to recall the history of a white clay production or an object that used to be solid or singular, but now it's in fragments. 100s relates to the Newport cigarettes. My mother smoked Newports when I was growing up, and I don't know if she smoked them until she passed, but it's like using Newport swoosh relating to the Nike swoosh, um, calling the news out, using the text from the news, but then cutting and splicing the text to tell a different narrative, and all amassed within an opulent structure that has gold and silver and blue luster and roses. This is the side view. I've been trying to figure out how to put my name or sign the work or put the title of the work inside the sculpture. And so you'll see poetic devices like using this text and stacking them as a way of allowing the viewer to know how to read or where to go or how to kind of go around the work. And there's the title. And so that if you go to the Whitney Museum and you see this work on view, you'll see on the wall the title is in green because the title in the work is in green. So how to negotiate that relationship too. But then also telling the viewer that it is a foil. What you see is not what you think it is. But my favorite part of this work is the hexagonal extrusions that have the image of the chicken strip, thinking about the first sculpture that I shared. These are, yeah, the chicken pattern is on these hexagonal shapes as if it's like strips of chicken, but negotiating the planes and edges of an object. And here you can see my name and my portrait as the signature. And so if the iconography is derived from a digital platform, then, and it goes onto the ceramic, the reality of the object also has to be imbued into the object. So I can't write my name on it. I feel like it's just intrinsic in the work that it would come from the digital construction as well. Thinking about, well, a friend of mine, Richard, told me, well, we should take a sculpture and then 3D print it or 3D scan it or whatever, and then use the shapes and planes to put the images on in the computer. And so that made me think about this work. He is a man, daily mystery, law and order, serenity for us all. The show at Wesleyan was not solely about Jason Stokely, cop who killed Anthony Lamar Smith in 2011. It wasn't just because of his acquittal, but it's an amassment of all the textures of what creates this experience that then make these works. And this one is on view at the ASU Art Museum right now. It's hard to think about living in a place where people around you don't see you as a human, even though you may walk and talk and you have hair going out your ass just like everybody else. It's really disheartening. So those sculptures were in the show at Wesleyan, and this is another installation view. On the left, you see an artifact that was given to me by a friend. That's a map of the US. It's turned around so you don't see the map because I don't agree with the language in the map. On the left and right flanking the passageway is a work called I Am Ready. Are you ready? And it's two flags on the right side, one flag on the left side. And the white on white flag is by itself, because I think like all of the issues in which we're facing and dealing with are a part of like white process and practice that needs to be negotiated in dealing with how we deconstruct race. And on the right side is the black on black flag with the black and white flag together. But I'm also relating this work to the language of a Tracy Chapman song, which Tracy has been a very influential person to me, and her work is quite revolutionary. Even though Tracy's very famous, I wonder how many people actually listen to what Tracy says in her music. Because for me, I think it's like there are a lot of possibilities through her music, and how to change or how to address what we're going through right now, and what we have been going through. And then this work is entitled Ground for My Fathers and His Fathers and His Fathers and His Fathers. And the text decreases in scale as you see it. And in parentheses, smoke and ashes. And so another calling to Tracy, but also a calling to my father and my father's father and his father and his father's father, family members who've served in the armed forces for the United States and have all now passed, except my father's still alive, but my grandfather passed and my great-grandfather passed. And so the objects that you saw on the floor were digital jacquard weavings of an image of asphalt. This is another image of asphalt. And we created this material and this space in the fabric of our day-to-day life, the street in which we drive on or walk on or ride our bike on. But it's black and has white pebbles in it, and it is facing the sky. And so at night, the stone stars are mirroring the gas stars in space. And I think that that's a really beautiful, poetic in our lived experience. But I also think that there's space where we can deal with the issue also. This is a large work on paper titled Black Space Equals Street Freedom, in parentheses, real road, embedded flags, no, I don't smoke. And so there are histories of life that have been embedded underneath the asphalt and underneath the brick roads in which we drive and we walk, but they're not often excavated. And these large works on paper, all my works on paper, are desiring to think about the text, the subtext, and intertext that exists between all the layers of what's being embodied and imbued in these pieces. Even though there's no text that's legible in the work in and itself, thinking about Okweon Wazer's essay about Glenn Ligon in his retrospective catalog is something that has been interesting for me to deal with, and without having to deal with putting the words in the title, but not necessarily in the work in which you physically deal with. Went to the Brooklyn Museum a couple years ago and I saw this teapot, which was a jar made into a teapot. It wasn't made to be a teapot. So in the bottom you see the thick walled jar is too heavy to make an effective teapot. And that kind of proves my point about European appropriative practices around the production of ceramics and the co-opting of ceramics produced in Asia. Japan, Korea, and China all have a history of white clay decorative objects that serve specific cultural purposes. So why would you take an object that served a specific purpose as a jar and turn it into a teapot? It makes no sense to me. So I embedded in a new collage to make a new set of decals, but then I made this work, calling certain things out by name, like Jennifer Schultz. Some people know her as Barbecue Becky. She lives in Oakland. She teaches at Stanford University. But I don't call her Barbecue Becky. I call her Jennifer Schultz because she needs to be acknowledged for her performance and her ignorant ass behavior. And so does Rachel Dolezal in the top right corner. But, it's hard to deal with people when so many people are able to just get away with their behavior. And so Shattered in Sheets, News, Texts of Privilege, Convict the Oppressors, Gilded Time and Constructs, ALS, ASB, More Memorials, Ming, Meissen, Kitsch. And so this work is one of the latest amassment sculptures that I've made that are that are recalling and engaging all of the layers of all of the things that I've explained to you about my work up to this point. You see a kitsch object or a vessel produced from a kitsch mold on the bottom left of the object. And then I put the Ming Dynasty image from the Brooklyn Museum onto that pot. Sheets of clay that are desiring the capacity to mimic paper, a to-go food box that had been 3D printed, that shrank to scale. So if you could pick that thing up, you would see that it is the same size as a standard to-go box. You see architectural motif. You see a recalling to modernist geometric painting, non-representational painting, all amassed in one object together. In my work, you also see these things here that they look like little fingers that are curling over. Those are cones, and they're pyrometric cones, and they're made out of certain materials to melt when time plus heat reaches the temperature in which they're engineered to curl over. And so I use those and I gild them as a signifier for gilding time, gilding energy. There's another collage, recalling places that I've been, recalling places I want to go, memorializing figures that are important in history, thinking about signs and symbols and how they relate to each other, but also how they have nothing to do with each other, but they can sit next to each other just because they exist. This is another work, mass to go plus Meissen and more, blue scale collage, bars plus chains plus oil slick. And so I'll just deconstruct the middle part of the work where it says blue scale collage. Collecting, or here in the middle, you see a hexagonal object, and on the surface, you see an image of a figure, and there was a historical trade hexagon jar made by China, specifically for the purpose of trade, and the form that it's on is a kitsch mold from the 70s that I have in my collection in my studio. And so then putting the image of the historical object right side up on the upside down kitsch object and kind of putting them together, but then taking all the light blue iconography and decals that I have and then putting it around the object. So it then extends what the blue and white history can be in contemporary society, still acknowledging the place in which it originates. This is the oil slick that I'm trying to communicate through the work. Last year, I had the pleasure of having another solo exhibition at California Fine Arts, and it's entitled Black Ice. It's a large 8 by 14 foot sculpture, a smaller 4.5 foot by 4.5 foot sculpture, 4 ceramic tiles, and a digital wallpaper collage, separating the middle space of the gallery for only the viewers to operate, similar to what happened at Wesleyan, but the sculptures were kind of artifacts in the middle. In this work, our bodies are the only thing that took up the most room because the work desired you to look down and engage the items and objects embedded within them. The collages on the sculptures that try to make the ceramic sheets look like paper are made from screenshots and collections of different news articles. The news article here is talking about the Smith family, the family reunion, the Smiths. You know, there are a lot of Smiths, and can the Smiths have space all on their own without having to be related to other Smiths, or, is there, how do we deal with the history of gaining the names of the ancestors who were once enslaved? Or how do we deal with or rectify the issue of gaining the name of the person in which we once were enslaved by? My name is Irving, and my family was enslaved by Scottish people who lived in Virginia. But to go a little bit further, Black Ice relates to the song by Goody Mob from their Still Standing album, which is a very revolutionary album of the 1990s. Black ice is the clear ice that forms on the surface of the black asphalt. But black ice also relates to the black ice air freshener that you can put in your car. Another installation view. The wallpaper collage, it doesn't matter, like the work is 60 feet long, or I don't know, it's a digital collage. And so I can print at whatever point I want. I can print fragments or cut fragments and show fragments wherever I want. It doesn't have to be limited to or only the whole thing, if you understand what I mean. When I share the work with someone, they get a USB or a file from WeTransfer, and then they print it. And so to think about the expansion of what is an edition. This is another large work on paper entitled Streets and Stripes, Crosswalk equals CrossFit over cores, real road relief, blood, tar, grass. These are made as collagraphs, but they're monotype. Well, and collagraph is a kind of monotype or monoprint, but it also has collage object on the surface, which is not, it's not Shinkolé because it's not all paper, but it's a collograph because the texture of the objects is then embedded into the plate, and that I can print that plate one more time that then will have the history of the other objects that I've embedded in the paper or printed on and added into the other paper into a new paper. So it's layering and mimicking the layering of the historical stratification of the contemporary landscape. Oh. I have been trying to figure out ways to take those digital collages that I made that I've been printing to put on the ceramic and then turning into paper. This is a 3 by 5 foot light box that I've made with a specific collage just for it, titled Mixed Messages, Streets and Screens, AOL plus Lottery. And recently, as Alex shared earlier, I put together a commission for the Contemporary Art Center Cincinnati, which is a like 28 by 40 foot wall, working with Amara and Tia, who is the senior curator at the CAC. This collage is still very, like all the iconography and information is so still, but it makes me really think about what my graduate school advisor told me, Denise Ward Brown. She said, how do you make a work from a noun to a verb? How do you make an artwork be a verb? And I'm constantly trying to negotiate, how does my work perform as a verb? And the verb or the action that one deals with a lot of artwork. But I think when it relates more complicated to content, when the viewer is moving around trying to suss out the point in a work, I feel like in some ways that's also a part of the verb that's inherent in art making. But now how do I find more agent parts of the practice and tools that I have to help inspire action, to make change? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. Um, yeah, so we'll open it up. We have one question on the YouTube comments now, and then yeah, for anyone on the YouTube channel, just to manage questions best, I'll be keeping an eye on that, and then we'll also have our MFA cohort with questions as well. To start, I guess I'll open with the question we had on the YouTube stream. It was from Margaret Cross, and she asked, I'm curious for Kahlil to say more about ideas of mirroring histories of white supremacy and colonialism, such as in works addressing oppression of / violence against Palestinians in Israel, Palestine. How do you find ways to reconcile the intertwining of systemic racism, acknowledge the intrinsic parallels without collapsing differences in these histories?
Well, I ain't really touching the occupied territories in the state of Israel. I don't know if that's, I don't have ground. Like, I'm only working from where I am. I'm not working from places where I went there and I learned and I was present and I had experiences, but I haven't gotten there yet, I don't know if I ever will. Because that's that's a very complicated reality. And I'm barely able to rectify my own experience with having Kahlil as a name and my father having a name as Gibran. But when I was in Ben Gurion Airport and they asked me, "What's your name? What's your father's name?" And I said, "My father's name is Gibran." And then they were like, "Oh shit, okay, your father's name is Gibran." And then they said, "Well, what's your father's name?" And I said, "Robert." And he was like, "No, you're going to be detained." And when I was in Jerusalem or leaving the state of Israel, I was detained for 4.5 hours, naked in the airport. Those were the only 2 objects from that experience that I was able to save. And so I'm thinking about histories and time. It may already inherently become collapsed, just like when we think about answering questions in itself. Sometimes we never arrive at an answer, but we arrive somewhere as a place to speak from. And so I'm kind of trying to work it out. I don't really have an answer, but I know I'm not touching the state of Israel and the occupation in which the country is engaged in, because I'm living in my own apartheid in the United States. This is speaking from there. All non-white people live in apartheid in the United States, no matter how much money you have, because it's a mental apartheid, not just a physical barrier.
Yes, I'll go. Looks like Raja has a question here in the cohort, and then we've got 2 questions in the YouTube stream, and then looks like we got a few lined up. So yeah, I'll have Raja ask her a question now, and then I'll pop over. We got Nikki and Aria.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. It was very thorough, and I really enjoyed it a lot. And I guess my first question, you mentioned that you had this large collection of ceramics and pottery that you had made from a very early age, and so I was curious if you wouldn't mind going into how that began. I believe you said 12, the age of 12 you started pottery, so I'm just curious, like with school and how that came about and sort of how that kind of evolved to maybe not so much into the work you're making. I know you've already talked about some of that, but just how that started you on your way. Thank you.
Thank you. When I was 12, I sang in the choir. I played saxophone. I was a YMCA Leaders Club member. I volunteered at the farmer's market up the street from our house on Saturdays. Well, not from our house, from my grandma's apartment. And my father thought that I didn't have enough to do. He thought I didn't have enough going on. And so he took me to this open studio session that a nonprofit called South City Open Studio and Gallery opened in a predominantly Black neighborhood that's no longer the neighborhood that it was 15, 16 years ago. But at that time, it was a way to experience and be with others. And I went one Saturday and they said, oh, here, sit at the table and do something with your hands. And I didn't really like it because I think I had long fingernails. And at that time, feeling things underneath fingernails was really weird. But I turned around and I saw a pottery wheel. And I said, I want to do that. And they said, well, you have to come back next Saturday to do that. And so from every Saturday on that I could go to the pottery workshop, I was there. I have the first pottery I ever made on the wheel at my house in St. Louis. I have my first piece. And there's a certain level of freedom that could be arrived at making. And it's funny that those first couple pieces of pottery that I made were Black. Not thinking what I would do in the future. And so the Black vessels that you see that I shared in my slides, those come from college and graduate school. And so from that time at the pottery workshop to college, I participated in a portfolio development program at a place called Craft Alliance. And there I was able to learn from older people who were hobbyists and potters and practicing people. And they really mentored me and supported me, but also it was tough. I was a 16-year-old Black kid from Southside St. Louis in University City, Missouri, with all these people who don't look like me. How are they going to negotiate? 17-year-old young Black kid busing down from inner city to this, pottery studio. It was a tough experience, but I learned a lot. And so there I met a woman named Pam Keskin Stanley, who introduced me to the idea of going to the Kansas City Art Institute. And so I applied to college and I applied to SAIC, and KCI called me on the phone. I was on the bus, the public transit, to go to Craft Alliance. And the guy said, the letter that you received is not your real award letter. Your real award letter is in the mail to you. I have some good news. You are awarded the full tuition scholarship to go to Kansas City Art Institute. I just about lost my shit. Between state money, scholarships, and pennies that I had collected and the major support that I get from my grandmother, I was able to go to college. And then I was learning through a history that was not for me, that then I'm now becoming a major part of. And something that Carrie James Marshall always says is like, how do you negotiate dealing with art making when they have so many people, like the world already has so many people to talk to, but how do you make art in a way that they can't talk about art without bringing you up? And that's when I think about the pottery, it's been a skill. It's been something that saved my life. It's something that has made space where I can share with others. And it's allowed me space to think more complicatedly around a lot more issues and the malleability of different material, even my own daily life and my own performance as a human.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
It looks like we have a question from Nikki Green.
Ooh.
Asking if you could talk more about boundaries, separation, and distinction. They're thinking about your chain link fence work and the way it serves to keep in, keep out, designates space, but is still porous.
Well, I gotta tell you, the chain link fence is a black pattern printed on white vinyl. So the white vinyl mirrors the white wall in which the chain link is on. The chain link pattern is on. So it's implicating the wall behind it, and that inherent is implicating the institution in which the work is being shown, or desiring to implicate the institution in which it is being exhibited. So the boundary is the emotional relationship to the boundary that one may or may not be able to rectify or navigate. Or it also, chain link is permeable, but when you look at my chain link pattern, there is no permeability. Whiteness, or the infrastructure of white supremacy, is almost impenetrable. It's not porous. It's not like a chained blockade of fencing around a plot of land where you could desire that you could be in that land on the other side of that fence, because it is structural, and it's almost as if it's a scrim, but in fact it is the wall itself. At the time of putting that work on the wall at Kahlil Fine Arts, I thought it decorative, or I thought it as a stage device for the show. But it's become a little bit more complex since then in my own navigation of it.
Thank you. Looks like I had a question from Ralph, and then I'll go back to the YouTube chat with Aria.
Hi, Kahlil. Thank you so much for the talk. It's very inspiring. There was something that you mentioned earlier in your talk about felt oppression, and like how you've been like enduring that for so long forces you to be numb, and like how that then function. I'm like really interested in the way that that functions in the work, and how that becomes present in the work, and how do you negotiate presenting that in the work, and addressing the audience with a presentation of that. Because for me, there's also a part of that that implies an entropy of resistance in some way. And I'm also really interested in how you see that forming the shape of your sensitivities, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense, because there's a lot of like at the time of an experience, one has that very moment to engage with and deal with and communicate through. But you also have another, you catalog it or put it somewhere. And when you fill that box up so much, you're at one point, you're like, oh, it happened again. I'm so tired of this. But at another point, you're like, oh, okay, let me put it in a box. I'm gonna put a number on it, and I'm gonna tag it, and I'm gonna put it away for later. But that same performance mirrors my experience in college, where in sophomore year, junior year, senior year, you had to continuously change what you were doing. You could never make the same thing over and over. So you had to constantly be evolving. And that came along, like part of what came along with that was the institutional reminder of evolution. So in terms of the sensitivity of experience, I too, inherent in my brown Black person experience, have to continue to evolve. So then it's mirrored, that then it is intrinsic in the work, because look at all the projects that I've shown you. Each one is different. Each one keeps challenging perspective, performance, interaction, scale. You know, it's like I'm on this trajectory to keep changing and want to keep evolving. But why too can I not be like one of those white artists who continue to show the same thing over and over and make, make a living and be able to survive? Like I don't, it's a tough balance. Um, but there, but I also don't want to do that.
Right.
So how do you balance both of those? How do you balance your personal desire, your will to work, and your desire of imagination? But the last part about that you asked about presentation, in the work, there's also I'm making more room for things that are funny, more things that are private jokes, so that I can have a conversation with a friend about one part of the work that the majority of the audience of the work will probably never see. And so that sensitivity then becomes resistance in humor. It becomes resistance in excitement and shared sorrow. But then making, one way to deal with that is making room for yourself. How do you make room for yourself and your dreams and your work, but still be as fucking critical as you can? And be the fucking best at what you do at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Like how do you make a lithograph that has the content and the need embedded in it? How do you make a sculpture do that?
And then can I do a follow-up question?
Okay.
So much of your work has to do with detritus and creating works that show them in elegant forms. And I guess I'm just kind of wondering when are look at and then say, oh, this isn't working.
Say that one more time.
Are there pieces that you look at once you realize it and then you say, oh, this is not working?
No, because it's made out of detritus, but I'm also recalling like objects that are wait, are you frozen? Oh. Yeah, you frozen. Sure. I don't know. It's it's a complicated thing about things that exist and things that don't exist, and how do you balance between them? Because they look like detritus, but they're also not. They're like super refined, manufactured. Like the clay particles themselves are super refined and manufactured. So it's like it performs and looks one way, but in fact, it's like very expensive material at its core. So it's a little bit tough. That's an interesting question. Because I'm also like the rocks and the grog and things in the work are not yeah, it looks like trash or detritus, but it's hard for me to get away from where the material comes from. And that's something that I'm trying to figure out how to share with people. Like how do I share that with the viewer, that it is engineered? Like that's why I'm thinking about in industry and industrial production instead of like soul studio artist production. Like how could I build a factory to make all these things? And I probably would no longer be making the opulent objects that I'm making, but I would be making something that would build anew, not necessarily just making these artifactual constructions. Did you get all that?
Somewhat. I'm gonna check the recording. My internet has been in and out, so I apologize. But
Oh,
yeah.
it's cool. It's okay. Alex, is there anything? What else we got online? Or what else we got from YouTube?
We got, I have my own, but I'll go to Ari's because that one's been sitting for me. I think Aria, my apologies if I have your name.
Araya?
Araya. And it in your installation work, the use of structure or restructuring the architecture of your 3D work what are you considering when designing the layout, user experience wise?
I think it depends on a case-by-case basis. And so the installation at Wesleyan University was 3,400 square feet. And so since I had works that mirrored the ground and the sculpture that showed the sky work, there was already this kind of parenthetical construction that could be present within the space. And I had so much space to play with. I could have works on the ground. I could have big wooden construction. I could have something really high on the wall. And I could play with proportions and the aesthetics of the space. So yeah, I really like responding to spaces when they're offered or when I can, to where then everything also changes. But it also depends on how much time I've had to live with the space. So my show at Calhoun Fine Arts, where the sculpture is 8 by 14 foot on the ground, I knew, like, I made that work just for that space. So there was 3.5 feet to where anybody could walk on the sides of it. So it's still like respectful of the engagement in a way. It's not so accessible. It's going to be shown sometime in the future where it'll have a lot more room around it, where it will be more accessible to different people, people who are supported by wheelchairs and walking support. So it's like everybody could have access to it. But yeah, it's a case by case basis, and I try to work it into the, like, how I negotiate space also is trying to be negotiated into how I deal with the work or construct the work conceptually and materially.
Let me just check. Yeah, my
Work, so it's like, sorry.
Yeah, thank you for answering all of these. One of the things I was wondering is that the consistent theme kind of, so I got so many notes from while you were talking. There's so much good stuff. The standout things, kind of in the early work when you were talking about kind of recreating the kind of cityscapes and that going upward and then having the sky motifs. I was wondering more if you could speak to that, the kind of going up and that movement, and then also one of the things that's always stood out to me with the sculptural work is your choice of pedestals or the construction of the supports, and if there's an interlink of that.
So to go to the first part, I grew up where my grandmother was like really big into Christianity, God, the Bible, very important. Not like beat you over the head with it, but like she'd say, what would God do? What would Jesus do? And then my father would take me to Eastern Orthodox Christian Church. And then I went to Catholic school for 2 years. And then it's also always trying to negotiate that reality of my familial life and the reality in which I'm inheriting, but also like my own personal desires. And I always thought, like, why would somebody beat you up at a Catholic school if we all know violence against another person is wrong? And I got beat up a lot. But I think about that. So in terms of like now coming to being able to make whatever I want, in a way, the sky is a space for, is relative to our dreams. It's relative, or has been constructed as a space of where we should go to, because we will be liberated from where we are presently. And if it's constructed out of digital information, it makes me think, well, is that really where we need to go? Or do we need to deal with what we're dealing with right where we are? And so, yeah, it's tough. It's really tough. Because so many people have died and their blood has flown over asphalt, but it's also, but if the asphalt are the stars, someone you and both and I know, Modu came to my studio one time and he said, well, you have this imagery printed in fabric, woven, you know, in some cultures, they work from the top down, you know, in here, it's like inextricably linked to success is inextricably linked to going from the bottom to the top. But when you think about our reality, is that really how we need to be going or where we need to go? So that's why the clouds are a construct or a kind of negotiation in that way. But the platforms, they're so heavy. So a lot of the sculptures you see have so much space underneath them to 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 allow for as little of the platform to be present as possible. In a way, some of them, like the wooden tables from Callicoon in 2017, those platforms were like tables and long structures as a way to like kind of like for them to disappear. Whereas in the wooden constructions for the undocumented series, they are together. They're supposed to be one and they're supposed to be relative with each other. So some of them have patterns in them, like the large 20-foot long one that have, you know, mimicking train truss bridges or just bridges in general. And then the big piece at Callicoon that's on the floor, it is also mimicking steel truss bridges, but similar to ones like in Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia, where it's like really long triangles holding up and like made out of steel. So yeah, the platforms are a desire to recall the world or like the built machinery, the machined world.
Mhm. I guess kind of follow up, and then we have one from Darby as well, is with the mentioning of that kind of top-down structuring and the fabrics. One of the things that you had mentioned with some of the patterning you were putting on the sculptures as well is that they were limitless patterns, like the rose pattern that was on those. I was wondering, yeah, if you could speak more to the importance of that being a limitless pattern, or if that was maybe interrelated to that idea as well.
I mean, hey, geometries throughout cultures are, you know, have been used as a means of communication. I'm not necessarily saying that I'm recalling all those things, but I think it just relates to the fact that the digital realm is it's material, it's data, it's code and stuff, but it exists immaterially because it's all these banks, these data farms that exist all over the world, to where, I mean, in a way, the platforms, the patterns in the work, the patterns in the decals, all of that stuff is all kind of a part of this long continuum. So it's just kind of like constantly is mirroring each other. But I actually didn't have the YouTube up on my computer, so now I have the YouTube up. And the person who asked the question about the how do I consider designing the structures for user experience and layout, that's a friend named Ari in Kansas City, and not Araya. Araya is when you were saying her name, I was trying to think about, I was thinking about Araya, who I worked with at the Whitney, who is in charge of team programs.
Oh, okay. Well, glad we got their name correct. Question from Darby.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and discussing your work with us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I was wondering, with your source material coming from a lot of screenshots and internet-based research, I was curious about your feelings or your investigations into surveillance, and if that plays a part into your work.
Oh, that's a tough question. I do have a book that I have been slowly trying to get through. Let me close my presentation so I can, oh, okay, never mind. I have a book by a writer that was published in Duke University Press. kind of commenting on the same thing. I'm not necessarily working through surveillance in the similar ways that she's talking about it. Maybe it's inherent in the work because you referenced it. But it's called Dark Matter, or Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness by Simone Brown. Really interesting book. But she starts talking about Fanon at the beginning and how the FBI followed everything that he did, everything he said. And we're all being watched. So I don't know if I'm not cognitively engaging with that when I'm in the studio as a kind of meta structure or substructure within my work. Maybe it will become part of it in a more physical way. But I think that in my, like, being vocal and being verbally present against oppression and violence that occurs in communities in which I'm a part of, it, like, people survey, everybody, they're watching me all the time. So it's like, it may not be present in the work, but it's present in my life experience. So, yeah, like I completed a project with Richard Munaba through Wesleyan University again. They commissioned us to make a digital sculpture. It's a interactive website. I can put it in the chat. It's an interactive website that is recalling and reusing a lot of the information in which we are dealing with and seeing. That's it. When you go to the website, it'll have that Netflix sound will come on when you get to the website. How do I? Oh, that's not the chat. Here's the chat. It's called Safety First and Fantasies Blockchain. And let's go back to the YouTube. And I'll give it to the people on the YouTube too so they can see it. So this project is also kind of mirroring that surveillance, but like flipping it around. And there are live additions to Twitter that are constantly updated. And there's also a music, there's a playlist that I created that I'm constantly adding to it. So you navigate it as an object or as a website, but then it has living and breathing parts to it. So I'm surveying things that are being surveyed by others. So it's like a feedback, like it's a mirrored experience, intrinsic and physical. It's a lot to think about. Surveillance is a lot to think about. Especially with the protests. They got drones out, and all over this country, they got drones out watching people, catching people's faces. So they can find you at home and take you out your bed, put you in jail.
Yeah, the cell phone tracking.
Yeah.
What's going on? And there was a report going around in Portland that they were marking license plates of cars that were at the protest to watch for later. And then it's all. Yeah.
All this just to arrest 4 people, arrest 30 people who kill people.
Yeah.
People don't want to change.
Yeah, the police brutality against the protest of police brutality. This is so.
It's a weird feedback loop.
Yeah. Yeah, it really
like
is.
Yelling into multiple vacuums simultaneously, so that then the noise becomes mute, or like the sound becomes mute. I won't say it's noise because it's not noise. It's voices, it's people really trying to say something, but it becomes mute, especially with the evolution of media in this country. I just finished watching Mrs. America, and that show, you know, it's like the 60s and 70s, and how did we get, like, it's like one part of how did we get here? And a lot of people don't like the show, but I find it quite interesting to figure out how to negotiate, you know, how did we get to where we are? It's tough.
Yeah, it's God, yeah, that's such a long. I was just recently watching the Adam Curtis documentary, the All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, and just seeing that evolution of that systems theory, and that like really doubled down on natural order and how incorrect that was, and then how that's all bled into Silicon Valley, and that those and a lot of that the Ayn Randian things just getting so subtly incorporated just in like search algorithms and things like that. Yeah.
Nikki Green that asked the question earlier, you know, she lives in San Francisco too.
Yeah, it's I guess because that's like yeah, that can veer on forever. It's
Does anybody else have any intent, like any questions?
Yeah, Raja, did you have a question, or is that answered?
Yeah, I think it got answered though. Thank you.
Cool. I know the YouTube is on a slight delay, so if anyone on there has any final questions, we can wait a minute for that to show up. I'm trying to look. I was just like scribbling on a piece of paper because I got to transfer all this stuff over to my sketchbook. I think one of the things that stood out to me early on, and I thought was interesting, was in those the earlier sculptures where you're placing the objects in and then burning them off, and that kind of presence and absence and sort of the negative space, and then how that developed with that black ice of that presence and absence, and then the viewers taking up so much of that space. And also that initially you were saying it was kind of too complex to process at that time. Is that something now you feel like you have a handle on, and how that's developed with those ideas?
Yeah, you know, it's a lot because it's also relates to constant moving, desires of moving too, and like being in different places and spaces, where, you know, we have deep relationships to places in which we grew up or spaces in which we once inhabited. And if you've been somewhere for so long and you leave and then you come back and you start to see your experiences, like your memories of being in those places and spaces play out in front of you as you arrive in those spaces as a new person or as an older person or a person with more experiences, it's really, really, you know, complicated to engage. And I really didn't know, it was hard to deal with that abstraction in that moment. And for the following like next 6 months to a year, because I was doing that very thing. I was making objects that encapsulated such a rich and specific time in my life that I didn't know that I was building histories simultaneously as living them. And those objects are embedded with objects from that very time in which I was engaged in. And so the presence of absence, the presence of the non-existent rice that you see in the form of the work, you know, is very similar to the rice salad that I was eating that my friend made for us to eat together. Or the can that I found on the street made of steel that then becomes the steel glaze on the object, but also the ridge texture on the object simultaneously. So it's like how it's also like how, when we live and love someone for so long, and those persons are no longer the persons in which we fell in love with, and they grow and they evolve and become a new person, but we still hold on so tight to the love, not only that we have for them at that time in our lives in which we were together in that way, but now we have to now learn how to love them in a new way for the persons who they are now, and still, and never forgetting where we once were together at the same time. I think, yeah, that's all deeply embedded in those pieces.
Mm.
One thing I also didn't talk about much, but like the desire to use text as a way to make like a kind of akin to concrete poetry, where you use text and words to make things physical and give three-dimensional form to language that you may just see flat.
Mm.
And I think that's one structure within the ceramic sculptures and the collages that that the language is now, is instead of just talking about the persons in which were the victims to violent acts and the histories of violent domination, you talk about the oppressor and highlighting and acknowledging the people who did the bad things, not forgetting why it happened. You know, we talk so much about George. Of course we want justice for George Floyd, Sandra Bland, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, all these people. But we also can't forget the infrastructure and the people who reinforce that infrastructure that allow for this same thing to continue. You know, it's like everybody wants to say, Trump, 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 Trump. It almost becomes like EDM music in my head, because it's not just Trump, 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 Trump. It's all white supremacy. It's all white people. You know, it's all the structure. You know, it's like we can't put blame on Trump. It's not just, there's a rise to Trump. Why did Trump become president? Because all those people who voted for him in the electoral college did not want a woman in the presidential office after a fucking black man. They did not want a woman in the office. I don't care about her policy. You know, I don't care about what she's done, because her and Bill Clinton are really fucked up people. But it's because they didn't want a woman in the presidential office. I'm not going to say White House anymore. Jane Elliott, I listened to a really great talk by Jane Elliott last night, who is an anti-racist activist. And she's done many studies and like projects with people. And Jane said that, stop calling it the White House. We want to take down white supremacy. She said, let's call it the president's residence. Let's just call it the president's residence instead of the White House, as a way to renegotiate what we're facing and what we're dealing with. If we truly want change, we have to change it all. It all has to change.
Yeah, I think that's a good note for us to end on. I think that's kind of the sentiment of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thank you so much for the talk and the questions. It was so like really giving in your information or thoughts, and it's just so nice. So yeah, thank you so much for that.
Thank you all so much, and I really appreciate you listening and sharing with me today. Look forward to being able to come see you guys in person sometime.